So, and as a reminder, this meeting is being recorded. So we'll make that available afterwards for you all if you have to drop off at any point. But we encourage you to keep yourself and your computer and cell phone on mute during this presentation. And if you're using your phone for audio, please mute your computer so we don't get the feedback issues. Anyone that has questions during this, they can use the chat box to either just say, I got a question, or write down your question specifically. We'll get to those at the appropriate time during this session. Our plan today is to go till about 3:30 and with our panel discussions, but plan to leave plenty of time for open discussion Q&A during this. Before we get started, I'd like to thank our sponsors for the meeting that help us keep TMDA moving, CAI, Emergo, UL, BSI, Norton Rose Fulbright, Med2Market, StatKing Clinical Services, QA Consulting, Inc., Galen Data, Health Tech Insight, and Oriel Statomatrix. And I also want to give a special thanks to Oriel Statomatrix that has offered the use of this Zoom platform for today's meeting. So as I mentioned, today's subject is on design, development, and design transfer of medical device. I am Joe Skraba. I'm president of TMDA. I'm also the CEO of Advantage Diagnostics. And I would like to welcome our three panelists, Pete Miller, Andrew Enke, and Taylor Downs, and appreciate your support and help during this. And I would just, at the beginning here, like to turn it over to you all to do an introduction of yourself and your firm. And we'll start with Pete.
Thanks, Joe. Hi, I'm Pete Miller. I am Vice President of Research and Development at a company called EM Device Lab. And we are a startup company here in Austin. I've got about 25 years of design and development experience, with the last 19 of it being in medical devices with various companies, being mostly in the spine industry. So companies that like Zimmer Spine, RTI, Surgical, companies like that. Thanks.
Thank you, Pete. Andrew?
Hi, everyone. Glad to be on the call today. I did my undergrad and master's both in mechanical engineering, and then I did an MBA at UT Austin, so hook 'em horns. And I have been in med device more from a consulting and private contractor. I have over 4,000 hours in SolidWorks design. That's the 3D CAD design, primarily in metal and orthopedics. And most recently have been branching off to plastic injection molding. I am one of the owners and founders of Mosey Baby, which is a at-home fertility syringe based out of Austin, Texas, and also one of the co-founders of Bridging Medical, which is a medical startup for long bone fixation. Glad to be here.
Thank you. And then Taylor.
Hi, I am Taylor Downs. I'm the Vice President of Evo Design. We've been in business for 23 years. We have offices in Watertown, Connecticut, Ohio, and Ningbo, China. We also have had the opportunity to work with Joe developing the Advantage diagnostic device.
Yep. All right. So thank you all for joining and being participants in today's panel. So I wanted to kind of kick this off with kind of taking us through the design development process and kind of starting at the beginning. You know, a company decides to start a project. Kind of what are the first steps that you go through to kick off a project? And we'll kick that off with Pete.
So the key early on is just developing the idea and seeing if it's, developing a scope of what you're looking for, and and working on some concept ideas, working towards that place where you can and build that business case. Particularly with a medium-sized company, they're going to look for a business case approval, right? So you got to do some concept work with some thought leaders or whoever came up with the idea, whether it's internal or external, and build that. Do some concept, maybe prototyping, and really get to a point where you can figure out whether this is a real solid idea or not before you start building out your team and getting to the next phase.
Okay. So Andrew, any differences for you?
I think Pete brought up a very good point. One of the first things that I recommend for anyone who's looking to start a new project or anything that's related with the med device is first make sure that you have a business case. And Pete brought that up. Is you're trying to get approval, whether you're a smaller company, a large company, and you have a project and you're going to present that to senior leadership, or if, let's say, you're a smaller startup and you want to seek investors, you need to show how your product is going to provide value to the patient and also be able to generate money. One of the challenges is what the market will pay for a specific product is sometimes less than what it takes to manufacture it. I think sometimes there's a misconception of how cheap it is to manufacture something in plastic. And if you look at the R&D and the tooling that's invested to make a simple plastic part, sometimes it can be very, very costly and cost prohibitive to make a return on investment. So one of the first things I'd recommend for anyone looking to start a project, whether it's a small company, large company, or looking for investors, make sure the numbers work. Make sure that you have a way to show that your product or your concept can generate money.
Okay. Thank you for those thoughts. So let's just take it to the next step. We've gone through that. We have a business case. We are, solidly, now we're ready to kick off a project. Taylor, kind of tell me who you form on your teams, how you start those types of projects.
Yeah, so it actually really depends on what the project is. Our team includes both design and engineering. Our perspective is that, the designers really interpret what the consumers want, what the end users need, and what marketing wants. So we typically involve our designers very early on in the process, but our engineers are incredibly important to that as well. So we do a balance between both of those teams in order to balance what the end consumer wants and needs, the manufacturing cost, and the end product cost. So that's really kind of where we start, and it depends on the project goals and project budget, what point we get to before we kind of pause and do a reassessment.
Okay. So Andrew, any differences or any things that you see from your side on how you're doing that?
That's pretty much in line with what I see to get on the team. One of the things that I always encourage anyone who's starting something out to do is make sure that you have a medical specialist, typically a doctor or someone who's in the healthcare industry who's going to be administering the device or using the device, and get their feedback early. Sometimes I think that people have a concept where they're going to use the design inputs that they themselves think would be needed. And then when they talk to a surgeon or they talk to an OBGYN doctor, they find out that the concept that they have has some significant flaws in it, or some requirements or specs that need to be revised. So one of the first things that I always recommend is try to get some early drawings, concepts, hand sketches, whatever it is, in front of people who will be using this, and listen to their feedback. Listen to what they have to say.
All right. And Pete, do you have anything to add there?
Sure. Yeah, I think you take all that. Those are great points. You take that input and feedback on early concepts, and you really, to me, the most important thing is you're working towards developing those user needs, that user need document. which then translates in the design inputs. And you do your design user needs from your users, right? So it's not just one designer or two. You really have to make sure you're capturing the overall market. So guys and ladies of different skill sets or different practices, and really capturing the market that way. But building out those user needs, getting a full list and documenting it is just crucial. That way it translates into your design inputs. That tells your engineers what you're designing, what you're going to verify and validate, as well as then building out your risk document too. And getting those early on. Earlier you get those 3 documents is really essential, because that's your roadmap for the entire project. And then if you really do it, spend a lot of time on that, and then get approval from the entire team, so everyone's on the same page when you're done with it, and say, this is it. This is our this is our product that we're going to make. Is everyone in agreement? Yes. Then move forward, and that gives you the roadmap then to move forward and complete the project.
So I'm a mechanical engineer by training. Pete and Andrew are both mechanical engineers. Evo Design takes a little different tact, and I just wanted to give Taylor an opportunity to kind of describe the work, the backgrounds of the people that are at Evo from a design and engineering side.
Yeah, so our team is 50-50 with industrial designers, including myself, and our owners' backgrounds are both industrial designers. The other half of our team is mechanical engineers. Within that, everybody kind of has specialties. So some of our mechanical engineers and some of our designers have specialties in prototyping, and some have specialties in sketching and concept development and design research, which is a part of my background as well. So it's an interesting combination of the team. I think it's great because we can pull in different specialties for different projects depending on what we need at the time throughout the project. And it's also nice to have a diverse team, whether, in some projects we need to bring on an outside electrical engineer, which is really important too, to have one additional perspective. So for us, having all of those different perspectives is really important. And I think Pete touched on it earlier with that design criteria and getting everybody on the same page. I think that's really important early on. And it's nice to have the different perspectives so that everybody looks at something from a slightly different angle, really hones in on that design criteria. And then that design criteria continues to be evaluated throughout the project and readjusted as needed. But that's, I think, the most important for us is that balance of the team of people who can do a variety of different things.
And your industrial designers, Taylor, typically what's the degree that they have?
It's actually called an industrial design degree, but all of our industrial designers have a product design focus. So there's a lot of different things you can do with industrial design. So you could be a car designer, you can move into interior design, but everybody on our team has a product design focus. And we do have one who has a biomed design focus as well.
Okay, thank you. So move on. I wanted to talk a little bit about a voice of customer and kind of what's the engineer role in that early stage development of those product specifications, and start that with Pete.
Sure. I think companies take a different path for that. Some include the engineer. Sometimes companies just go out with a marketing person to try and capture all that data. I think it's key to start one of these projects, to me, with both sides, right? You got to have your marketing and your business side, and you also have to have your technical side, whether it's whatever type of engineer that the project requires. But as often happens, sometimes engineering is brought on a little bit too late or after the fact. So they're getting watered down translation of what the actual user asked for. So it's key to have these engineers out there, I think, hearing that directly from the source early on as well. So marketing and engineering working together, early on with the user is real important.
Mm-hmm. Andrew, you have any insight on that?
Absolutely. My strongest recommendation for any product or app, if it's going to be some sort of program or tool that uses an interface, get early concepts in front of the user as soon as you can. If you are doing an actual physical product, I strongly recommend 3D printing and paying extra money to get high resolution 3D prints so you can get the form, fit, and function in front of the user. I have found that when I share an image or I try to write a paragraph in an email to the user, oftentimes I'll get a response that, oh yeah, that works great, that works great. Give you a quick example. When I was working with Mosey Baby, one of the things that we did is we were designing a fertility syringe, and when we gave it to an OBGYN to see if she would recommend this to her patients, we gave her a 3D print, and she looked at it and she said, you guys, this is way too large. I don't know what you were thinking, but you clearly were not thinking when you designed this part. And so one of the things I recommend is you cannot capture that type of feedback unless you have something that you can give to users at the beginning, such as a 3D print or model, or something that's tangible. It doesn't have to be a fully finished product, but something that you can make. If it's something like a hospital bed, maybe build something out of some 2x4s from Home Depot. If it's something smaller, use a 3D print. If it's an app, try to get some basic concepts down so that people can see what it is that you're trying to design.
Okay, thank you. Taylor, you have any insight there on voice of customer?
No, I completely agree with all of those. I think getting something in front of the consumer that's tangible is really important, but I also think it's important to consider all of the users of the product. So sometimes the product could be used by, the scrub nurse, the surgeon, and then the person doing the sterilization. So I think it's also really important to make sure you aren't just talking to the surgeon, because somebody else has to handle that device somewhere along the process. And it's important to get each of those different perspectives along the way and create different user profiles for each of those different end users. Sometimes one of the end users could be the buyer as well, so whoever's purchasing the equipment. And I think it's important as you go along the process to also go back and check in with those user profiles and make sure you're addressing the needs of each one of those different users. But I think the other answers are spot on too. I think getting something physical in people's hands makes a big difference, because not everybody can even read a concept rendering. People in the field can read them, and to us it seems really obvious, but once you get something in somebody's hand, I think it's much easier to get feedback.
Great insight on all the users. Yeah. Thank you for that. So want to also talk about all three of you worked with early stage companies. What's the role that you have from a development standpoint in helping to raise money and financing for the company, and how do you do that when you don't have a budget yet, you don't have money in the door yet to support those activities?
I can say that, yeah, sure. I can say that I have just played kind of a auxiliary role in that part of it. I've tried to stay a bit out of it and focus on moving the product design forward and letting others handle that. However, you do have to get creative with smaller companies, and just the resources that you use, you have to be very careful about your budgeting and whatnot. And so it's just there's a bit more creativity with it on the development side, and sometimes you have to stagger things, whatnot, as you'd expect.
Andrew?
I have taken a very active role in fundraising. And a word of encouragement that I would give to anyone is fundraising is hard. It is very, very hard. The misconception I think often comes is you have a product, you join a startup company, you're putting in a lot of sweat equity to get a product done, you're passionate about it, you believe in the vision, and now you assume that other people will buy into the same vision that you have. And what I have found is it is very, very, very hard for people to invest early. And I cannot tell you how many times I have been told, come back to us in 12 months when you have your product on the market, or come back to us after you've done clinical trials. And it's a very challenging chicken and the egg situation, because you're sitting there and you're thinking to yourself, well, I can't start clinical trials unless I receive funding. And if I don't have funding, then I can't start the clinical trials. And so back and forth you go. One very strong word of advice that I learned while I was doing an entrepreneur class at UT Austin was, see if you can get people to provide work, not necessarily that they'll donate time or they'll donate cash, but see if you can get them to donate time. And so one of the things that I have done is, for example, reach out to a 3D print shop. If they charge a high price to do some 3D prints, ask them, hey, I'm with a startup, we're limited on funds. Would you be willing to donate or reduce your cost? In turn, we'll provide advertising or get you connected with some other doctors who potentially could be a higher revenue stream for you. Reach out to an IP attorney and say, hey, we'd like to reach out with you and collaborate with you. Would you be willing to receive part ownership of the company if you did the patent application for us, or things like that? And so one of the things that I strongly recommend is that trying to raise money is very, very hard. And in the early stages, if you're having a slow go at it, don't let the funds stop the progression of the project. See if you can reach out to individuals or people who are going to help you get this project done, and see if they'd be willing to donate their time to get the task accomplished without actually getting funding. That would be my best recommendation.
Okay. Taylor, you've dealt with me at a very early stage and had all of those things, needed to get budgets and things like that put together, and you guys did work without the knowledge of getting paid for it. Kind of take me through that process in consideration that you guys go through.
Sure. So I think in general, we're a little more similar to Pete in that we typically work on a fees for service basis, a proposal-based basis, but there are a few cases that come along where there's a product that we see that we really believe in and a leader that we see that we really believe in, and we're willing to take a risk. A lot of that has to do with the business plan that we receive. We have a few different options. We do have an equity partnership. We also have a royalty-based partnership. And I think a lot of that for us is really built on trust and the people that we're working with. So we are sometimes willing to do that. It's not standard for us, though. It is kind of a risk. But I think getting a lot of that information up front, making sure that there's a solid business plan in place. For us, it's knowing that we have a good relationship with the partner. In this case, as Joe mentioned with you. And I think it also has to do a lot with the connections that we see and the opportunity that we see for the project going forward. So a couple of the other things that we have done to help people, if we do believe in the idea, but we don't think, hey, we can invest a lot of time in this, is we'll say, we'll use some of our spare time with our team in order to help you create a deck for your venture capital funding, or to help create a couple of initial concepts inexpensively or for free, just to get a visual so that you can get in front of somebody in order to raise money. So I think a lot of times not having a visual it makes it really difficult to communicate an idea. So that is something that we've done in the past, but for us, it has a lot to do with the relationship, and then also what the setup is and what that looks like in terms of a partnership.
Right.
Yeah. Yep.
Thank you. Let's transition, we talked about working with physicians and working with kind of the end users and keeping all of those users in mind from a design development standpoint. But I'm interested in just talking about the challenges and pitfalls of working with those folks too, and how do you mitigate those challenges? How have you dealt with them? How have you managed some of these folks that come in with pretty strong egos and thoughts on the importance of their contributions? So I'll try to be as diplomatic as I can here. Andrew, any?
Can you, so are you looking for interfacing the user with a doctor type situation, or I'm not sure I quite understood the question.
Using the interfacing the engineer or the development team with these potential end users of the products that you're developing.
Yes, absolutely. One of the things that I've had personal experience with is working with surgeons with orthopedic parts. And as an engineer, we're trained to look for strength of materials, geometry, failure points, making sure things are compliant with biomaterials, making sure that if you're going to have a component that's implantable, it's going to be a class 2 instrument or a class 2 implant. How is it going to react to the human body and things like that? And the surgeons have been trained from a different perspective. And so where those two worlds connect is where the inputs are going to come from a doctor or a health professional or an end user, and then translating those inputs into a physical product. And one of the best ways to do that is to see if you can get face-to-face time with the doctor. I know that there's HIPAA laws and you need to make sure that you sign the correct forms, and so that way patients, you're not violating any patient information. But one of the things that's very common practice, and this is what I did, was I received hospital permissions and approvals to go into the operating room, and I would work in the operating room with the surgeons. And as while they're doing a surgery, they would reach out and say to me, see this part right here, it's too big, or this right here is too small and I can't perform function X, or I can't perform function Y. And as you visually see that, that's where I would take that information as an engineer and go back and try to adjust an instrument or an implant to meet the user needs as well as a good patient outcome.
Thank you. Pete?
I think, yeah, that's a great point, Andrew. Getting the engineers in the OR or whatever setting, hospital setting it is, clinical setting, or cadaver labs, seeing that in use, and just understanding what the issue is, what the problem that you're trying to overcome is, just, it's very beneficial. And, I worked on a lot of different design teams. I'm sure we all worked on design teams where there's just a large varying skill set that also comes into play. So you may have a team of that's worked with, a physician team that's worked well with the company for over several products. So they may be very good skilled users, but you have to really understand and the skill of the entire population. Right. And so that's your design team may be able to make anything work. Some guys and gals are super mechanically minded, so they can make anything work. But it's got to work for everyone. Right. And so a lot of times we do all these evaluation labs. I call them evaluations, where before you're ready for validation, you go out and evaluate the prototypes and dial it in with your users in a simulated scenario, right? And then you work on your validation, right? So it's the validations on the finished production equivalent product, validating the user needs. But then even beyond that, I mean, we've learned, we've done focus groups after the fact with groups outside of our design team, of people from different parts of the country and different, that have different clinical needs. and you learn new things all the time with every different set of users. I had a peer that always said, you know, you learn something after you launch, you learn something after the first 500 surgeries, after the first 1,000 surgeries, after the first 5,000 surgeries. You just keep learning on this, but you got to try and catch as many of those big items as possible early on before the thing goes to market. Otherwise, it's going to cost you, obviously, clinical issues is the most important, the safety. But then beyond that, obviously, it's going to cost you a lot of dollars if you don't get it right.
So, Pete, we'll keep with you on your projects and the projects you've worked on or seen in your experience. When you're laying out a project plan and project development, what are the things that sometimes get overlooked in that planning that cost significant money or take significant time in a project that often get overlooked?
Sure. The things that really eat up a project timeline are prototype builds, the manufacturing time. So if you're designing a product and you start developing your prototype and you go through your first prototype build, you know, if you're going outside, that you could take 14 weeks to get those prototypes back, right? So plus a few weeks of modeling and doing drawings beforehand. You're sitting around waiting for that. I mean, you're working on other things at the same time, but that's gobbling up time. So if you don't work hard on getting that input early on and getting, you know, taking out, like Andrew and Taylor have mentioned, taking out prototypes or 3D printed items to the users, and getting it as close as possible before you go through those rounds. You're a product that may take normally 1 or 2 rounds of prototypes, now all of a sudden takes 2 or 3 or 4 rounds of prototyping before you can actually get to your production build and your final verification validation. That gobbles up the timeline like nothing else. Both, you know, time, you're adding, you know, 14 weeks at a pop, and then it's also a lot of money, right? So to build these prototypes, implants cost money if it's an implant type device, but instruments cost even a lot more money. So, and they're a lot more complex. So that's, you know, typically where I've seen just, you know, time wasted. Once you get to testing, by then you should kind of know how it's going to go. I mean, you've done enough evaluation labs to get to your validation lab, and mechanical testing. You've done some early prototype testing. So you always see some things could happen in final testing, but by then you should be pretty dialed in. It's these early rounds of extra rounds of builds that really take the time.
Andrew, you have any insight on things that are overlooked or not planned for properly in development projects?
I agree 100% with what Pete said. In orthopedics, it's very easy to differentiate. You typically have implant or instrument, and there is no really anything in between. Either it's an instrument that helps facilitate getting the implant in the right location, or it's an implant that's actually going to stay and remain in the patient for some period of time. I would recommend that a huge oversight that I saw when I worked with orthopedics is the failure to allocate enough funding for the development of the design and the manufacturing of instruments. And what seems to be common knowledge in the hospital industry, at least in North America, is that hospitals typically do not pay for instruments. Hospitals only pay for the implant. And this is something that I think is often overlooked, is that when people are working directly with the hospital, there needs to be an upfront cost for paying for an instrument tray to be in the hospital. I realize that many attendees who are on this call today probably are not in orthopedics and probably are thinking to themselves, oh, that doesn't really apply to me. But one thing that you do need to think about is, are there costs associated with your product that aren't necessarily going to be paid for, that you are going to have to figure out a way to include those in your delivery and selling of the product. For example, who's going to be paying for shipping? Who's going to be paying for storage and warehousing fees and things like that that maybe you're not aware of. One second thing that hasn't been discussed directly, but this is more on a business side of things. For any of you who work directly with hospitals or surgery centers, payment terms can take a very, very long time. And one of the things that's challenging is that you may provide services and not receive payment for them up to 6 months after you delivered a product. So one thing to be aware of for anyone who's working directly with surgery centers or hospitals or clinics is make sure you establish payment terms and know when you're going to be reimbursed. And that's important because you may be very, very cash poor, but your accounts receivable may be very, very high. And so that's one thing to be, one thing that I would say is overlooked is looking at when you're going to be paid for your product, your service, or whatever it is that you're delivering.
Okay. Taylor, you have any thing to add there?
So I'm going to go back a little bit just because I had something to add to the challenges and pitfalls, but I think it's also something that is overlooked and not necessarily planned for. I think doing the upfront design research, if there is a predicate product, so if there's another product in the market that's similar or there's something in that category, I think it's really important to go and spend some time studying that product, whether that means you're looking at, videos of the product and its usage, whether you can actually get into a facility and watch the doctor use it, or you can get a demonstration. I think that is really important to see, and also see again on each of those touch points and in each of the different user scenarios, what potential problems could come down the line. So I think that helps with the initial planning. I also think in terms of that, kind of the egos and that part, when you put a designer, an engineer, and a doctor in the room, it's like that you got them all right there. So I think it really comes down to like a good moderator or a good project manager who can communicate and kind of tease like the best information out of each of those people, because they all are kind of in their own lanes. And now, of course, there's crossover people, and I think the people who are most talented at their jobs know exactly who they need to bring in order to make the product better or make themselves better. But that isn't necessarily always the case. So I think having somebody in that can help kind of communicate or moderate between those different groups, and then kind of tease the right information out, and then re-communicate that information and get everybody on the same board. I think that's really important. Another area that I think that is overlooked and not planned for, if there's a device that has an interface in it, I think sometimes the interface development part of the process starts too late. So we recently developed a peritoneal dialysis machine, and we did the design portion. Another group did the engineering portion. They developed the whole machine before they decided to do the interface design development. And so there were some communication issues, and I think there were areas of opportunity that the engineering could have been better and the interface could have been better if they had both started at the same time and those teams had communicated and really worked together from the beginning to understand that, the user needs, the consumer needs, and then the doctor's needs on that type of project. So I think that's another one that if there is an interface involved, that's really important to get a team who understands both the workflow of the interface and also the design of the interface to make sure that it's meeting all of the needs.
Yeah, a few things that I've seen, lived through personally. I think things that get overlooked is the time and the cost around packaging development, around sterilization, validation processes, biocompatibility, testing that you have to do in order to sterilize, get a sterilization validation procedure done, and those types of things that can take what seems to be an inordinate amount of time and are very costly. So if you're developing low-cost products, the package itself can be oftentimes more costly than the product that's in it. So I think those are the things to also keep in mind as you're developing these types of products. I want to transition a question for Taylor and Andrew. You're both contractors, and just interested in how you handle IP development and ownership.
Yeah, so we really we don't want to have IP. So for us, it's written into our contracts that as long as all of the bills are paid, the IP is owned by the company that we worked with or the individual that we worked with. We also don't have anybody on our side who does patent development. So we always recommend that that a patent attorney be brought into the project. Sometimes we do consult directly with that patent attorney, just to make sure that we're clear and the patent attorney is clear with, the communication and exactly what the product does. But for us, because we're a consultancy, once all of the bills are paid, the IP is all owned by the company that hired us.
Andrew, any difference there?
Very similar approach. Industry standard in North America, and what I have found with most consulting, whether it's in med device or outside of med device, is that the intellectual property always resides with the company that is hiring the consultant. And so what I've always done is I've let people know that I'm very passionate about engineering. It's the reason why I spent so much time in SolidWorks and CAD design, and that's where my passion is. And then I let them know that I have experience with working with patent attorneys, but I am not a trained or licensed patent attorney. And I always encourage them to seek out attorneys. I have a couple of recommendations of some great attorneys that I've used in the past. And one of the things that I always let my clients know is that they own all intellectual property, and that anything that I design or develop will be owned by them. If there is something that I develop during the design process that will add value that they can add as a claim inside of their intellectual property, I will be added as an inventor. But being an inventor on a patent does not mean that you receive any royalties. It does not mean that you receive any ownership. It just is giving credit, similar to a Journal of Medicine article that says, hey, this person contributed to this patent. But exactly to Taylor's point, I always make sure that the client's aware up front that all intellectual property stays with them. One other thing too that I did put into the chat window, it's a very simple URL. It is patents.google.com. You do not need to be a trained attorney to learn how to use this tool. You literally can type in any sort of device or instrument or name and look up people's patents. I strongly recommend using this tool early in the design process to make sure, number one, you're not infringing upon any other companies or person's products that may already be out there. And number two, I use it as a great learning tool to see what's already out there. There's a lot of patents that have already been released and they're expired. And some of the stuff can be used to help brainstorm how you might solve a problem using a similar mechanism or a similar design concept.
Okay. On a similar area, how about handling non-compete issues from a contractor standpoint when you're asked to a client wants to hire you but has put some non-compete language in there? How do you manage those types of things so you don't restrict yourself in the future? Andrew,
I'll take that one.
Okay.
Sorry, Joe. It's a really good question. And I think each case is different and a little bit individual for us. As a brand and kind of as a company, our philosophy has always been that we'll never take two projects that would be competitive with each other in the market at the same time. So that's kind of our, company ethics. Some of those non-competes though do last a pretty significant period of time. So I've seen non-competes that are 5 years, I've seen 10 years. And that's when we really have to step back and evaluate for our company and the size of the project, whether or not that is worth the effort for us, and whether or not it's, if it's in a category that we do a lot of work in, if it's a category we don't. So there's a lot of variables there, but it's typically agreed upon before a project started and before information is shared. So it's before we begin the process of really digging into the project, writing a proposal, and spending a lot of time. That's typically covered for us up front.
Okay. Andrew?
Very good advice. My recommendation is be cautious and make sure that what you're designing does not restrict you from an existing contract that you have with the previous client. I had a situation several years ago where I was a consultant. People came out and they reached out to me. They were very, very excited about my work. They said, we want you to focus more on our company and work exclusively with our company. I said, I can't right now. I've got a lot of projects going on. They came back again and said, hey, we'd really like you to come full time. So I said, okay, great. And I jumped in and I was working exclusively with them full time. And I did sign a non-compete with them, but I let them know that, the other projects that I'm working on aren't in the same medical space that you are. Well, come after a year time, I had been reached out by some other people who wanted to do some more consulting work, and the company that I was working for wasn't happy about it. And they started to increase the scope of what their non-compete was. And they said that, well, we're this med device and we potentially could design that, or we could potentially sign that. And it was very, very challenging. And so I ended up leaving with them. And the reason why I share that story is that when I did do some consultant work with another person, they wanted me to sign an existing non-compete for a 2-year period of time. And I actually declined that work based on my previous experience of having been restricted to work on a specific space in med design. So my word of advice for anyone on this call is to look at each case, case by case. There is not a one size fits all in legal documents, and just look at what the verbiage is and be very, very specific on what you can and cannot design while working in that area. And in some cases, it's best just to walk away. It may not be worth the business to do it. And in other cases, it may be a good opportunity and it is worth taking on the limited scope and being a little more restricted if it's a good business opportunity.
So great words of caution for those people in consulting roles. Pete, as an employee, how do you address non-compete issues when you're joining a firm?
Yeah, I think it's very similar. You look at the term of the contract and the non-compete itself, and I've seen where you just have to be real careful on how it's worded. For instance, if you're working for a mid-sized company, try and limit it to be fair for both sides, right? And limit it if you've been working on, say it's spine, and you've been working on the cervical area, limit the non-compete to that area as much as possible so that you can go to another company and work in different areas and move to lumbar, do some lumbar projects or that kind of thing. I've had a lot of peers that had to switch, industries because they were locked in for what I've seen is generally 2 years is the typical kind of non-compete for an engineer in orthopedics or spine. And so, a lot of times they have to switch industries for 2 years, and it's a big hassle. If you want to be fair on both sides, obviously you don't want to develop a product and then jump to another company and develop a very similar competing product. That wouldn't be fair, but you also don't want to be locked out of your livelihood, right? So it's just a matter of being detailed and careful about it, like Andrew and Taylor have mentioned.
And to add to what Pete
All
mentioned, that's exactly right. I had a good mentor of mine who was specialized in knees and hips. He started on with a new company and he could not even talk or mention anything that was associated with knees or hips. So he went to spine, just like Pete was saying, that sometimes in an industry, you may have to change your focus for a period of time.
Mm-hmm. All right. I see some questions coming in. I've caught a couple of them, and talk about your experience with regulatory, and when's regulatory get involved in the projects, and or when should they, and or when do you not go to them? Pete?
I think they have to be in there right away. I mean, I think marketing and engineers, they're carrying the heavy load as far as going out and grabbing the feedback and input from the users to build that business case, but regulatory's got to be part of that business case. I mean, it's you're looking at risk and business opportunities, right? And so one of the significant risks is regulatory. It's IP, it's regulatory, it's can you manufacture it? You know, can you make money on it? So you have to have that initial regulatory opinion early on, and then it's have that regulatory person check in every once in a while, or go to them, obviously, and get an update on that regulatory strategy as you go through the product development cycle.
Andrew, you have anything to add there?
Definitely. And I've worked with Elisa Maldonado in the past on some regulatory, and what is important is communication very early on, and making sure that your design of experiments are going to meet the regulatory standards and requirements. There are a lot of articles and a lot of documents that you can search in the ISO database, as well as the ASTM database. And it's very important that you reference these to make sure that you're compliant with the most recent standards, whether that's going to be in orthopedics, if it's going to be in biologics, if it's going to be in diagnostic systems. Make sure that you have communication very early on with regulatory.
And Taylor, what's been your experience working with in that realm?
The majority of the devices we do are non-invasive. So for us, the regulatory usually comes just a little bit later in the process. So it's important, I think, like Andrew mentioned, to understand what those requirements are early on. But with a non-invasive device, sometimes a regulatory expert can be brought in a little bit later, as long as the team understands the basic regulatory requirements and needs before we bring somebody in that's really doing kind of extensive documentation. So I think it depends on the type of device that you're developing is when that person comes in. But it also depends on the team understanding and the team knowledge as well.
I had a colleague that he would start with a vision of a box of parts and an indication for use statement, and then work backwards in his project planning to encompass all the things that you needed to do to get to that finished product and that indication for use with a regulatory approval. So, Elisa, maybe you could help us with some of the chats that have been coming in, either read some of them off, or if there's a way to group them together and kind of read a theme off and get the three of these panelists to join in on that.
Absolutely. So the very first one that came in was from Dr. Don, if he's still on and if he wants to unmute his line. He commented on the importance of clinical utility and connecting that to user needs, user input, and reimbursement. Dr. Don?
Well, hi, thank you for letting me join your webinar. I've never done that with one of your webinars before, and so I felt like lurking, but I did use my real name. I've been in a circumstance where when I was consulting long ago with a biotech company, where the engineering enthusiasm can sometimes become mismatched with the clinical reality. And I think it's important to for instance, a lot of the discussion today has been orthopedics. And in terms of looking at the problem quantitatively, if you go into an operating room and you watch some of the surgeries being done, and you're very motivated, you can see from your science and engineering knowledge that you can really help this orthopod fix this problem. And the orthopod, not that doctors have egos, but they will presume that the best possible product that you could generate is the one that solves their particular problem. And so it's important to make sure that their problem is one that other orthopods deal with. And you could always go to someone else who says, well, of course, Harry has that problem, but he's the only one who uses that surgical approach. And so it's important to make sure that the problem you're solving is widespread, relatively widespread. And in terms of the qualitative analysis of the problem you're solving, you've got to, I would think it best to keep up on how the problem persists in the clinical environment. Because just consider the possibility that suddenly the problem you're dealing with to solve a particular, let's say, patient assessment, and suddenly that's no longer the standard of care. Well, now the problem's gone away entirely. And so I hate to say keep using the phrase of trust but verify. I think you just need to keep every so often checking in with yourselves and your teams. Are we still going in the right direction? Is this still as big a problem to solve as we thought it was originally? And it used to be many, many years ago, I won't tell you how many, that a salesman would come in and say, here's my new product and the hospital across the street doesn't have it. And there's donuts in the break room. Well, if the other hospital doesn't have it, then we should buy it. That'll make us look good. And then the logic came to be, well, can we get by without it? And
Okay.
then they take pride in not needing the product. And so I don't mean to keep second guessing yourself, but you've got to have a well-defined problem and a well spelled out clinical definition of the problem. Thanks for listening.
Of course.
Thank you, Dan. Andrew, Taylor, Pete, any comments on that?
Yeah, I
You know, one
agree.
thing I've noticed in my career is that, like any other product area, there are fads that happen in orthopedic surgery or other surgery of things that they were doing and how they were doing things, and those fads die and those products die as well. So, Pete?
No, I agree totally. I think that's where it comes in, and seeing a greater population of users and really making sure those user needs that you're working on developing it works for the greater population. How big a percentage of the market are you going to try and capture? Because different physicians use different techniques, like you mentioned. So your technique takes that percentage of the market down to X percentage. Now you're only going to get a portion of that percentage of the market. So, and not just listening to sometimes the person that talks the loudest or voices the most opinions on a particular problem, but getting everyone's input as much as you can. Obviously resources are limited for the smaller companies, but whatever you can do, whether it's surveys or getting out, seeing them face to face, seeing their techniques, that all just makes a big difference.
Lisa, any another question?
Yeah, so Ryan Barrett had to hop off, but she wanted me to just a comment based upon her experience with 3D printing. She said, make certain that you make it very clear up front which measurement units are being utilized for 3D printing, because from her experience, she's had an unfortunate experience by centimeters from millimeters to centimeters and vice versa, that it can cause a tremendous amount of wasted energy, time, and resources. So that was just a comment there. And then I had Tarina Wilder if she's interested and willing to unmute and discuss a little bit about her input, her suggested input about having reimbursement as part of that discussion of design from much earlier on than what probably typically occurs. Tarina, are you willing?
I'm sorry, it took me a minute to unmute myself. What was the question again, Elisa?
You had commented, which I think is a very valuable comment and recommendation, is that reimbursement be a part of the design discussion at a much earlier stage. Are you able to elaborate, or do you want?
Oh, yes. So oftentimes, when it comes to certain design concepts and prototypes, understanding whether or not a design would very well potentially have a reimbursement pathway is something that needs to be discussed early on, because if the pathway is slim to none, the team may need to reconsider the design or the project altogether. So I wonder if the panel here has any experience with one way or another.
So we do have experience with that. And I think it's a really important criteria, like you mentioned, to bring up very early in the design process and understand what the potential reimbursement is, because that has an impact on what can be spent on the manufacturing cost, what can be spent, and what the design cost can be, what the individual unit cost can be. Once we know whether or not, what it can be sold for, and we understand, okay, say it can be sold for $20, the cost, we can go backwards and say, okay, the cost of goods can only be $5, or whatever it is with packaging. And so we can do an equation to look at all of the different elements and all of the cost, add in the manufacturing cost, and then back out from there what the design can be. So that can change what material we're using, what weight of material we're using, how elaborate the design is, how many colors there are, whether or not there are over molds on the design. So it can make a big difference to understand what your design opportunities are if you know what that end cost needs to be.
In your experience, in your experience, has there been an impact to reimbursement as it relates to the COVID-19 epidemic? Are there new policies that you're having to, at this point, deal with your customers, or is it just business as usual?
Definitely not business as usual. But we personally haven't had an impact on that yet. Our firm does have one of the 8 licenses to develop the JPL NASA COVID ventilator. So we're going through that right now, and we're kind of in the process of learning that. It's still a little bit early for us, but I think one of the other panelists might have a better answer for that than I do.
Pete or Andrew, you have seen any impact of COVID on development and costs and reimbursement?
Absolutely. It's had a tremendous impact on some of the industries that I work with. I've done a lot of plastic injection molding consulting for a company based out of Fort Myers, Florida. And most of their products are used for elective surgeries, primarily anything that involves a fusion. Right now, elective surgeries were limited in Texas. There was a period of time when they were allowing elective surgeries, but with the recent spike of COVID cases, the elective surgeries have been reduced. And if the surgeries are being reduced, the usage of this biologics plastic part is not being used also. So it is disrupting the supply chain and also the number of cases. Second thing is with another company I'm working with on a startup that's long bone fixation. We had lined up a couple of big donors that were really interested in our product. We had a cadaver lab that we were going to do some testing of some new long bone fixation screws. And now that that's been delayed, the investors have also delayed their funding. And so impacted both from existing companies as well as companies that are dependent on investors. So I've seen it impact both sides.
Pete?
I agree. I think the funding aspect has slowed down. It hasn't gone away. It's slowed everything down. On our current business, we're working on a device for the ER, and so that has changed our planned sales model. I think, reps aren't allowed to go in right now, so they can't sell face to face. So it's a matter of coming up with other strategies and how they're going to make those interfaces and make those connections and show the product.
So I'll tell you from our perspective, from a diagnostic product industry perspective, it's made a huge impact in those areas, and products that have a specific COVID application, whether they're diagnostic devices or PPE or those types of things. The FDA has launched the emergency use authorization process and are literally giving reviews and authorization to market products in days with significantly reduced regulatory requirements to get those on the market. Also on the reimbursement side has moved remarkably fast and has set up reimbursement codes for new tests and things like that. In a matter of days, they've issued new codes. So it's so from one aspect, from the governmental regulatory authorities, whether they be FDA or reimbursement and CDC, there's been remarkable fast movement and change because of that, and it's actually quite interesting to watch as a kind of a spectator of this industry. So I do see those things changing significantly.
And
how long that lasts, we don't know, but it will last for a period of time.
And this is Elisa. My one comment a little bit back before Tarina's comment, or to Tarina's comment about reimbursement. I've been on engineering teams where very much energy, time, resources have been put to adding features and functions to a device, because we get caught up in our excitement of adding features and functions, only to learn later down the line who's going to pay for it. The actual payers are not interested in those features and functions. And I think that also goes back to Don's comment. So I just thought I'd add that back in there, that it is really important to control, I don't know, to control, perhaps keep in scope the designing scope to who will actually conduct and do the reimbursement.
And going back to the very early stage of raising money, you won't raise money for a startup without a good answer to the reimbursement question.
And there was one regarding reimbursement here that, again, also consider as a tool to your potential clients and customers and users, that you pull together what's called a reimbursement guide, so that you have a clear guide to them, the easiest way for them to apply for reimbursement. So you provide them, the codes and the pathways and the process.
Yep. Okay, Elisa, any others?
Yes. So then we had quite a number. We had with Lisa Calkins, Karina P, and John Bernero commenting very consistently on having regulatory on as early as possible, especially through the design inputs and throughout the entire process. I don't know if any of them want to add to that, or if the panelists, I think we've maybe addressed that.
Yeah, we kind of talked about that piece early on as well. I mean, obviously, you have to know what your potential sales price is. So, I mean, so you can work backwards. One of the things, sales price and volume define what are feasible manufacturing processes that you can also consider in manufacturing a product.
I'm not sure if
Andrew, you have more to add there?
I'm not sure if I'm allowed to
Oh.
jump in here. I apologize, everyone. My name is West McKee. I'm the CEO of Brief, and we do regulatory tracking for startups. We do a custom solution for every startup. We do industry-wide briefs and all sorts of things. And so there are some solutions out there. Most startups tend to turn to law firms for this, and it's kind of a high-priced way to go about it. And so I'm not trying to add a commercial here, but there is a different way to do that. So if anyone wants more information, I'd be happy to talk to them in the chat, and I will let you guys get back to the regulatory discussion.
Thanks, Wes.
Yeah, this is John Bonero. So I think the main thing is that many companies are so excited about jumping into the design and prototyping of products, but I think the key thing is understanding the standards that you need to meet, as well as the regulatory pathway is important, so you can design appropriate prototypes and start evaluating them early, so you know you can meet them in the end. Nothing's worse than getting further down the line and realize that you have 6 months of testing still to go. Your investors and company and board members are not going to be happy with that. So,
Yeah, I would echo that too, in that similarly, the FDA is a moving target. I mean, I worked on a lot of projects that are typically 2-year long, 2-year projects. And from project to project, it's a moving target. So biocompatibility, like Joe mentioned earlier, sterilization, what was acceptable for one project, a year and a half later is no longer acceptable. The standard has changed, not specifically necessarily the wording of the standard, but what is acceptable and what the FDA is going to allow has changed. So, and usually it's a lot more work, not usually the other way around.
And I think you got to take into account the group within the FDA that you're going through, and that they don't always have the same standards and the same requirements, and some have other requirements. If you're only working in the orthopedic area, you get to know them, you get to know what their things are. But if you're getting away from those groups, they can have a very different issues or hot buttons that they want you to do that another group might not want. Lisa, any?
Yes. So I think back to the COVID discussion, and I think we've experienced this as well, is that depending upon what your device, your product is, we're experiencing not only a shortage of toilet paper in some cases, but also shortages of medical device components. So in diagnostics, I definitely see this shortage. Timothy Sullivan, he also has a comment regarding glass vials for like vaccines. I don't know if he wants to add anything specifically more, but that is something to consider, and we definitely see that as impacting the development of our devices. Timothy?
Yeah, sorry, hi. So Zeteo is one of our areas of focus is in nasal delivery of vaccines and countermeasures. And what we're seeing out there is in this space is that the vaccines that are under development for COVID, a lot of the organizations are now beginning to think a little bit further down the road beyond just the development of an effective vaccine or a post-exposure antiviral to the fill, fit, finish phase. And glass vials, the dominant route of delivery would be an injection, either an intramuscular or sub-Q injection. And so there's been a huge rush to tie up availability of the glass vials that are used either to package, bulk forms or the individual unit of use. And just recently, HHS essentially bought up a significant portion of the global supply of glass vials, tied them up. And so we're
Yeah.
seeing, we're seeing those kinds of things going on right now.
To the panelists, anybody experiencing supply chain issues and things like that that's impacting the development processes?
I am making a new plastic injection molding tool, and it's being done in North Austin. It took 4 extra weeks for my machinist to get the stainless steel that we needed to make the tool. So just basic trucking routes, basic supply chain, steel availability. Something is, trying to find a trucker to move it from city A to city B is challenging right now.
Taylor, you see anything on your side?
Yeah, absolutely. I briefly mentioned that we received the license to develop the NASA COVID ventilator, and I believe we got that maybe 30 days ago. And since then, we haven't been able to get the tubing that we need to filter the air through the device. So that's another area that we're seeing. Prior to that, we were seeing a lot of delays in other products getting tooling out of China, especially early on in the COVID virus. And then also getting the plastics that we needed for injection molding. So we're seeing it in a lot of different areas. We develop products outside of medical devices as well, and we're seeing a really big impact in some of those categories and things that you wouldn't necessarily think about. But I think the ship times and prototyping shops being closed, especially the China shop, in our China office, we were closed for almost 2 months. So we were definitely delayed and had to kind of be creative with developing prototypes here. We bought a new 3D printer in order to stay on top of creating prototypes for our clients so we wouldn't get too far behind. But there's definitely a few different industries where we're seeing delays. We also work in the package space, so packaging equipment, so the equipment that goes into an Amazon facility to fulfill boxes. And that industry has been really, really busy, but there's a shortage of stainless steel for some of those pieces of equipment, especially in the prototyping space. So we are seeing some interesting shortages that we didn't really anticipate going into this, but especially on the ventilator side with the tubing, and we're having to get a little bit creative developing our initial prototype here.
Yeah, we've seen similar things. Even if you can get the product, especially those products that are made in China, even if you can get it, getting it shipped to the U.S. is, a lot of those routes have been decreased substantially. So you get long lead times on just transport issues. Pete, have you seen anything on your side?
Thankfully, we haven't been directly impacted by product availability because it happened to be at a point of a project where we had things in-house right before COVID hit, but it is impacting our decision-making on who we have test our product. So there were considerations of going to some OUS labs, and we're not doing that. It's just not worth the risk because you never know when they're going to shut down. We just can't be handcuffed for a very long period of time due to those, what's going on now. I have seen it too in the past where, material-wise, like the others have mentioned with stainless steel, where back in the day, we had a lot of instruments that were made out of 455 stainless steel, and Boeing came in and bought up all the mill runs of stainless steel. So of 455. So we had to go through a lot of effort of changing all of our designs, and it was a big headache. Mm-hmm. It does happen.
Yep. Okay, Elisa, we probably have time for 1 or 2 more.
Yeah, we can leave it. It's open for the participants. Does anybody have a question to pose? Please unmute yourself and ask. This is open Q&A. So I can ask a question to start with is there a typical time frame for the design process, the duration? How long does it take typically?
Pete, you want
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously it depends on the product and what classification product you're designing, whether it's a consumer product or, class 1, 2, or 3 device. Some things that are similar to other items, 510K products, and it's just like another product, but it's different length or a different preference item, then those can go faster. But it's based on risk and risk to the patient and complexity. So, in the spine world and orthopedics, a lot of projects are typically 2 years, just based on needing to do 2 or 3 rounds of protos before you build your test parts, and that development time for user needs and regulatory and quality and all that. So, but for, the biggest thing to worry about is you get into the part of, get into that habit of saying, all you got to do is those projects I worry more about than any others, because it seems very simple, and the expectations from the owner or inventor are it seems very simple. All you got to do, but those can sometimes obviously be very challenging if the expectations aren't set right.
Andrew?
I think it varies widely. And I would recommend looking at regulatory, reaching out to a specialist like Elisa and describing what your product or concept or service or app will be, and then determining, are you a class 1? Are you a class 2? Are you a class 3 device? Are you invasive? Are you non-invasive? If you have a class 3 device and you're going to be implantable like a pacemaker, plan on years of development, months and months of research and development, and months of time of manufacturing and then testing, and then getting approvals. If you're going to be something that's very simple, it's something that doesn't receive regulation, and it's something that is non-invasive, you potentially could be on the market in a couple of months, and the primary design cycle is going to be just getting your product made in a certain type of material, or getting your part assembled, or finding a supplier to make your part. So I think it really depends, but I would strongly encourage looking at class 1, class 2, class 3 or non-regulated, and that will really help you determine where you are on that scale. Are you going to be less than a 6-month to market type of product, or are you going to be in the months to years type situation? And if you're in pharmaceutical, doing any sort of pharmaceutical trials takes years. And so just looking at where you're at in that cycle is important.
And Taylor, wrap up with you.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think knowing what type of products that you're developing right from the start, the level of complication of the product, the amount of testing that has to happen. I think another variable that wasn't mentioned is if you're fundraising, what's the lead time on fundraising, and will that put your development process on hold at any point? Are there areas where you might be put on hold in order to do additional fundraising before you can continue the product development process?
Yeah, and I think one of the facts of COVID is that it's very hard to get investment right now. A lot of venture firms are been on the sidelines. A lot of angel investors are not investing, so it's a challenging time to get new funding. So that funding cycle can clearly interrupt the development cycle times. So, all right, we're almost wrapped up here at 3:30. I have a couple closing announcements. Once again, I want to thank you to our panelists, Pete, Andrew, and Taylor. I want to thank our sponsors once again, CAI, Emergo, UL, BSI, Norton Rose Fulbright, Med to Market, Stat King Clinical Services, QA Consulting, Galen Data, Health Tech Insight, and Oriel Statomatrix. And our next meeting is for the Texas Medical Device Alliance is October 15th, 2 to 4 p.m. Regarding sales and commercialization strategies. It is planned to be at the Norris Conference Center, but we may be doing it remotely again. So just keep in touch, and we'll certainly keep you updated in our monthly newsletters. So with that, I will thank all of you for your attendance, for your questions, and for making this a successful presentation today. Thank you all.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you,
Thanks
Joe.
for the discussion.
Thank you,
Taylor.
Sarah.
Appreciate
Thank you,
it.
Lisa.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thanks everyone for attending.
Yep.